this Bangladesh will have to take current tariff is not enough. I mean, এটা বলছি ওরা তিনটাই করেছে tariff is one thing, but intellectual property, তারপরে ওই যে corruption, regulatory যে কতগুলি non-transparent activity আছে এগুলিতে have procurement including, yes. Procurement is also an issue that they have raised. So finally, আমি যেটা বলতে পারছি যেটা finally মানে আমাদেরকে negotiate করতে হবে, retaliate. We have no scope to retaliate. The US has tremendous market power, being a quarter of the world GDP. এবং তবে অন্যান্য ইকোনমিস্টরা আবার ওয়ান করছেন যে tremendous market power আছে, but not unlimited. So don't overestimate that market power to create such a so much of disruption in the world economy. Okay, you have to be careful. Acha. So that's there. So final যেটা আমি the expression use করেছি আমার paper. So I've put down all my thinking on this issue in the article published in the Financial Express day before yesterday. So this reciprocal tariffs, I'm calling it, as a sledgehammer unleashed on a glass house. Let's see if that glass house can survive. Thank you. Now, we are all looking forward to your
I was saying to take off from where you left, applying a sledgehammer to a glass house can only have one result, that the glass house will be smashed to smithereens. So there's not a question, it is a statement. Now what I was wanting to first alert all of you, this began by my wanting to ask my student to become my teacher and to give me a tutorial on the implications of the tariff regime which was being initiated by Mr. Trump, which is not beginning now. It is a process which started from his first regime, and it was actually continued during the Biden regime as well. And my expectation was that we would have a small academic discussion of professionals where I would be better educated on the subject. We had not appreciated that what was going to be an academic discussion would become a discussion of a national crisis, and that our discussion today would become so consequential, in which so many of you are assembled and all these gentlemen from the media are also assembled over here. And this was an unanticipated outcome of what was begun with a very modest objective. So let us take into account then both the wider issues and the specific implication for Bangladesh. Now, my view is that we cannot just view this tariff issue in a narrow context. It is part of major global changes which have been going on in the nature of the global economy. And the substantive elements of these changes are the relocation of competitive advantage across the global system. That historically, what began with the ascendancy of the United States as the dominant competitive economic power. When I was a student at Cambridge in the 1950s, there used to be a problem known as the dollar problem, and a book written by R.F. Harrod on the dollar problem. which was built around the fact that the US was the most competitive economy, and as a consequence it was accumulating dollar surpluses, which was creating problems for other countries in the world and how this should be addressed. I don't want to go into that part, but the transformation in the world system was going on. In the 50s, all the cars in Pakistan were mostly US cars. Most of you are not even, you will not even have heard of the names of Chevrolet, DeSoto, Dodge, Plymouth. These are all parts of my growing up process, and you people have never heard of it. Because the changing competitiveness in the automobile industry meant that by the 60s, Toyota was outcompeting General Motors. And a book was written about this, I think, by a well-known writer on the rise of Toyota over General Motors. And the changing comparative advantage in the automobile sector was then manifested in the rise of Japan, then Korea, and in the luxury sector, of course, of Germany and other cars. So today, you will not see any US car, not only just on the streets of Bangladesh, but virtually anywhere in Asia. I think some SUVs may be coming from there. I don't know about this thing, but mostly. But most of these would probably have been made in China anyway, if they were coming here. So that itself would not be a very significant factor. After all, in case you are unfamiliar with the fact that the pioneer of the EVs, which was Musk, most of his cars, which are now being exported, are made in China. So how this whole trade war will impact on Mr. Musk's business in China remains to be seen. We have to see, but that has to be kept. So anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that there was a gradual and now transformative change in global competitiveness, and the rise of Asia as the factory of the world was then a major factor in contributing to the hollowing out of the US manufacturing base. If any of you have driven from New York to Philadelphia in your visits to the United States, you will have seen empty and shuttered factories all along the way of steel mills and manufacturing plants. And this was a phenomenon which went on all over as the manufacturing comparative advantage changed. Global capitalism also was transformed in this process. None of you are, I'm pretty sure, maybe Ahsan, are familiar with the writings of a gentleman by the name of Samir Amin, who was writing in the 1960s and 70s about what he called accumulation on a world scale, where global capitalism was actually moving from a domestic base to a global base, and its business activities and manufacturing and marketing processes were relocated around the world in order to exploit greater global connectivity and the growing globalization of the economy. So that the big multinational corporations, even though they may be headquartered in the US, were really global corporations, and they made their profits, their accumulation, on a global scale. So the whole relocation was consistent with changing global comparative advantage and the changing nature of global capitalism. Now, this has had very serious consequences. When Stiglitz was writing about the challenge of globalization, he was seeing this as beneficial to multinationals and of adverse consequences to developing countries. on a rare occasion where I was more comfortable with the writing of my classmate Jagdish Bhagwati, he challenged Stiglitz and argued that actually globalization was, if anything, beneficial to developing countries, and it has certainly been greatly beneficial to countries such as Bangladesh. And the changing comparative advantage meant that the people who are now seeing themselves as victims of globalization were the white-collar workers of the United States. And this became the big political constituency of Mr. Trump in his election campaign against Hillary Clinton. So this was a transformative process in which the nature of competition meant that the US now became, or was, as viewed by Mr. Trump and his voters, viewed themselves as being now the adverse victims of globalization. So that people who were once seeing themselves as middle-class workers working in regular manufacturing jobs with pensions, many were having to seek a living in hamburger joints and places like that, because that sort of regular thing, and because they were not being able to upgrade the quality of their education to catch up with the changing technological revolution, they were not in a position to then reposition themselves in the changing global comparative advantage of the United States. So that there was a structural problem within the United States itself where they could not adjust to the changes in the global system. So this is the problem. Now the next significant problem was that we witnessed a move away from what we were now seeing as a rule-bound globalization process into the progressive weaponization of economic instruments in global trade. You are actually now using the access to a large market like the United States, or control of the financial system, say through the SWIFT process. All these were now seen as part of the globalization system based on market-based rules. The fact that you can now deploy this as an economic weapon was a new development. As you have seen, for example, in the war between Russia and Ukraine, Europe, not just the US, but Europe used the SWIFT system and various other processes. The deployment of sanctions, where you are then interfering with global trade, became part of that weaponization process. It wasn't that, Europe is fighting a war with at least they are supporting Ukraine. US is in a contestation with Iran over various issues. So, okay, you are entitled to then impose sanctions on Iran where you deny them access to your market. But what has happened? This has been globalized, so that all countries who have no interest at all in the relationships of the United States and Iran or the Russia-Ukraine war are now being caught up in collateral sanctions. And we are being part of the weaponization of the global trading system. So all these have now become instruments which mean that the whole notion that we lived in a world where market forces would become a major factor in determining international economic relations has now progressively moved away to do with this new world order. Now, in this process, you have to then see the application of tariffs. Tariffs have now become part of the weaponization process. It has now become a political instrument. Now, partly we are seeing this as being used as an instrument to correct what is a bilateral deficit, but it is also being used for other purposes. The application of tariffs initially against Canada and Mexico was over fentanyl exports. Now, can you imagine that? That you are trying to deal with a huge consumption of fentanyl within the United States and then blaming Mexico and Canada for letting this come into the country and then imposing tariffs on them. Now, this has got nothing to do with economics, and it could be applied then to many other areas as well, and it is being applied to many other areas as a policy instrument. Now, this means that the U.S. market, which was once seen as a very central element of the globalization process because it encouraged growth and development all over the world to access that market, has now become a strategic resource, and it is being used as such. So that issue now has to be taken into account. And tariffs, which determine the terms on which you enter that market, have now become part of the political instruments of the weaponization of the trading process. So this is the issue in which you have to see the application of these particular tariffs. Now, in these circumstances, the U.S. domestic economy, which was very strongly conditioned by the laws of the market, have now evolved, particularly in the context of the Trump administration, into a command economy. I mean, there are very few countries in which you are wanting to set economic direction and change change the economic opportunities available by the issue of political orders in those circumstances. So this is essentially meant now that all you, unlike all of you, I'm less of a believer in the triumph of market forces, but you are all my friends over here, ones who were less enthusiastic about market forces are now great acolytes of market economics. But unfortunately, the country from where you learnt all your market economics is now moving away from that process. And you are now having to deal with this new world order. Now, in these circumstances, tariffs have now been applied, but no one had any idea that it would be applied at a global scale. Now, what are the question you have to ask yourself is that what are the objectives of the Trump administration in applying these tariffs? Because the way Bangladesh reacts to it means that you have to also have a correct understanding of why they are applying tariffs. What do they hope to gain from this? And the primary mission, if you have read Mr. Trump's statements, in fact, part of his announcement when he was announcing the tariffs, is that he is wanting to return the United States to the 19th century period of import substitution industrialization. None of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the report of Alexander Hamilton's National Report on Manufactures, written at the beginning of the 19th century, in which he argued for using protectionism as an instrument for industrializing the U.S. against the more mature and advanced industrial economy of England. He was, of course, followed by Frederick List,
who was living in the U.S. at that time, and was distinctly happy.
But who became then a policy advisor of Bismarck when he was then wanting to industrialize a unified Germany, and again in order to promote industrialization against the more advanced European British economy, he too promoted the infant industry argument, where you were wanting to raise industries. So the United States then went through that process, and of course in the late 19th century, President McKinley then enhanced tariffs, again built on those assumptions. So this was done as a process when you are a rising industrial power and you need protection. So other developing countries also went down that particular road of import substituting industrialization until Zaidi came along and told us that was not a very good idea and that you should now completely liberalize your economy in your best interests. But we all went down that road, and the lessons we were getting from the US returned scholars was that it is in the best interests of all countries to do away with tariffs and to then go for import liberalization. Because look at the United States. How has it become the world's largest power? Because it had a completely liberalized economy once it rose to the top. Now, this is the instrument which is being completely reversed by the Trump administration. That he now sees that all my industries, which were now the pride of the US economy, are now closed or about to close. And how do I revive this? I want jobs to be created through a reindustrialization process. The US share in manufacturing industry fell, what used to be 30% of GDP. It has now come down to 10% of GDP. Perhaps even less, I'm not quite sure. Employment in manufacturing is now 10%. It used to be 30%. Okay. All right. So in those circumstances, the idea is that somehow I should re-elevate the share of manufacturing, and this will again increase the share employment in this sector. But I think a recent calculation was pointed out, I think, by, I don't know whether it was Krugman or not, that even if they were to do this, a lot of the remanufacturing which would take place would be highly automated, and that this process would at best raise the share of manufacturing and employment in the US by 2% to about 12% of employment, so that there would not be any significant gains to be realized from this particular process. However, this was the objective. Now, the secondary objective, or as an instrument, is of course what we are facing today, and that is the idea of export promotion. Now, the whole business of application of selective bilateral tariffs is really an instrument of export promotion, because the idea is that you are using the instrumentality of tariffs to persuade countries to buy more from the United States in the expectation that this would then close the bilateral trade deficit. Now, of course, as Zaidi has pointed out, since he is much more knowledgeable on this, the whole concept of bilateralizing your trade surpluses and deficits is unheard of in contemporary economics. And you are functioning at a global level, and that's the way you then identify your deficits and surpluses. This set of policies of export promotion and then import substitution has some contradictory elements in this. What may this be? One element is that I want to promote my exports, fine, and if I do that, then the trade deficit will narrow, right? But if the trade deficit narrows, then according to the formula that has been applied, imports will also be reduced. So that if I bring down my deficit to zero, then I will go back to 10% of the import duty. Is that not the way it works?
We are dealing with manufacturing export expansion. Manufacturing export expansion will itself promote import expansion as well, because manufacturing exports rely on inputs that are not necessarily available domestically. So you have to. That's part of the globalization.
No, so this is your further reinforcing my point that at the end of the day, your export promotion will actually not necessarily lead to import substitution necessarily. That essentially the trade gap is going to narrow.
Not necessarily. Trade gap, you see, one
No,
idea of trade economists is that a trade deficit is not a sign of weakness.
No, I'm simply looking at the way this is going to apply. That what would happen if Bangladesh were to reduce its trade deficit to zero? So therefore, it would come down to 10%, right? That would be the objective outcome. Minimum 10%. Now, what I'm trying to say is that if the trade gap for all those countries is progressively reduced, then the tariff would also be correspondingly reduced. This means that the import substituting effect through tariff protection would also be compromised. Because if you are protecting your industry with a 47% tariff, then there may be an incentive for people to then set up industries within the United States. But if it is coming down to 10% and maybe even less than that, then manufacturers will be much less inclined to set up industries because the level of protection would have gone down. Now, the difficulty also arises over here. You aren't just going to come down to 10%. There will be a progressive reduction in the deficit and a progressive reduction in the tariff and the degrees of protection that are accorded to the economy. This means that a high degree of instability will then prevail in the market regime facing prospective new investors in manufacturing within the United States. And so uncertainty will come in, and uncertainty is the biggest enemy of investment, as everyone knows. And of course, the big discourse which is going on, which is already impacting on the markets, is the whole increase in uncertainty facing not just the global system, but the US itself. And so this is all going to be consequential to meeting the primary goal of the tariffs, which is imports substituting industrialization. So that your expectation that there will be a large flowering of industries being set up both by domestic investors who previously, I don't know how many of you have recently visited the United States and have gone shopping over there. When I go to buy toys for my grandchildren, I expect to buy good US brand name toys if I'm going to a US toy shop, which are very famous. But unfortunately, when I look at them, it has the US brand name, but it was all made in China. If you go to a hardware store to buy an iron or a toaster, you will find it is all made in China. So now the Trump expectation is that toasters will once again be made in China, but made in the USA. But this will only happen if a prospective investor whose grandfather was making toasters once upon a time will now find it is worthwhile for him to come back after all these years and restart a toaster making factory in the United States. He will wonder, well, what happens today at even at 40% protection, will I be competitive? Certainly I will not be competitive at 10%. So why should I do this unless I can be sure that I will have a 40% protection for my factory? So the objectives or the outcome of this whole strategy itself is now being challenged by the economists you have mentioned and by markets and by people within the private sector within the United States. Now, let me quickly conclude because I'm anxious to enhance my education by hearing from, particularly I'm glad to see that we have got some of our manufacturers and exporters over here. I want to learn from them. Now, what does this mean for Bangladesh? Now, we have already seen what it has meant, that our tariff rates have gone up 40%, and then we have somehow immediately responded to this by sending off a letter to the US President giving itemized areas in which we want to increase imports from the United States. Now, I'm not quite sure why we were in such a hurry to do this without working out and understanding the full implications of what would be. No, it's very specific. But but the letter explicitly mentions certain items. Now, the question which we will have to ponder over here, I was asking Mahmood over here about this, is that how is this actually going to work? We have indicated that we will increase imports of a range of goods. Now, as has been pointed out, quite a lot of these have zero duty already, including something like cotton. So how will we then enhance import of cotton? Because there was no tariff barrier for the export of U.S. cotton to the United States. So, I don't know, the U.S. shares, 20% of cotton imports? About that. Now, you are not importing more cotton from the United States because this is a market decision made by Mr. Mahmood and his colleagues in the textile manufacturing sector. They blend cotton, they have the need for different types of cotton, they have different price implications of where they buy their cotton, and they have made market decisions that we will buy 80% of our cotton, quite a lot of it actually coming from India, some from Pakistan, some from Central Asia, some from Africa. And we are buying U.S. cotton. They give certain types of counts of cotton which are necessary to make denims which he manufactures. So in those circumstances, we will buy as much as we need if it is a market economy. Now, I don't know if you have been advising the government when you met them that this will not work and you need to return to Stalinism and go back to a command economy in which Mahmood will be ordered to import all his cotton from the United States. And then they will be ordered to import all their soya bean from the edible oil industry will be ordered to import and an executive order, and you will get 6 months. You will be fined if you do not do that. I mean, they are all private sector people who will be importing their goods from where it is economic for them to actually do so. No, so what I'm saying is that the lack of transparency in any case applies to all imports, not just US imports. I mean, one of the virtues of being a small economy is that you cannot afford to discriminate against anyone. So if you are having wrong policies, they are universally affecting every country with whom you deal with. So it may be sensible, as Zaidi would have preferred, and as it has been suggested in the USTR report, that we eliminate all these adverse practices which are affecting our trading regime. But the beneficiaries will be global beneficiaries, not just the United States. So that once you eliminate all these, then those who are already accessing our market under these circumstances will even further enhance our market and will enhance their exports without automatically benefiting the US. So the US would do a great service to other exporters to Bangladesh by, in fact, really insisting on this. But none of this would contribute to narrowing the trade gap by enhancing our imports from the US. So that is the particular point that you have to keep in mind over here. That at the end of the day, a protectionist regime is a protectionist for everyone, and moving back away from that into a more liberalized regime will be beneficial. So China will be greatly benefited from that. India will be greatly benefited from that. And that would be the problem we would face. So how Bangladesh, therefore, reacts to this will really be something which we obviously it has huge ramifications for our economy, and you want to show that you are acting. And what has been done has presumably been done in the best interests of that. But the consequences of that are going to be much more uncertain, because not only are we reacting, already 50 other countries have reacted. And how the US will respond to this will not emerge because you are first in the queue. It will emerge on the size of the transactions involved. So if the trade deficit of Vietnam is $100 billion, in contrast to Bangladesh's deficit of $6 billion, I will not give you any prizes for guessing who the US government will be more responsive to in their negotiations. So you are now living, therefore, in what is known not as a market-driven world, but in a transactional world, right? In which everything is now up for negotiations, and the variables involved in the negotiations are not exclusively related to economics. So many other variables can be brought in. If you want to go to the head of the queue, you may have to put other issues on the table than just the offer of higher imports. What those may be, I have no idea. But what I'm trying to point out is that once you move away from a rules-based, market-driven system into a system of command economics and weaponized trade, then you operate in a completely different world, and you get into a world not of the survival of the most competitive, but the survival of the strongest and the best negotiator. So this is the issues which I would want. So how this will affect Mahmood, how it will affect Parvez, how it will affect people, you have to take this into account. And when we make our policies, we should take into account this wider changed world in which we are actually operating.
I'm sure what you've said is liked by everybody. I would later on probably respond to a few. You've certainly brought out the idea that there's this import substitution strategy and the export strategy. So you have a view, and I will try to expand on that later on when I have the chance. And then you brought in the whole idea of the transformation process that is changing the world landscape as far as the trade is concerned, and industrialization and development, etc. And there is, I think you make a very good point about weaponizing economic instruments, and that's the critical. That's the elephant in the room. Here we have a situation where I think a large economy like the United States has shown the propensity to weaponize many of the economic instruments, like tariffs to start with, and there is the SWIFT payment system, the US dollar itself being a preeminent currency for reserves as well as payments. So we will. I'd like to give some responses to all of these, and I'm sure we have a very rich group of people who will contribute to the discussion. But let me first go to our three distinguished panelists who have been waiting online. I apologize, but I think all of you know Professor Rehman Soban and his interest in this subject matter, and so we had to listen to him, and he has given a much wider coverage than we can think of. So but there's a lot of food for thought there. So we'll have to. The young trade economists of Bangladesh now should be able to, contribute. So may I now invite Dr. Salim Rehan to start off the response process, or you can have your own views. Salim is in Nepal, Kathmandu, Nepal, I guess. Kathmandu te acho. আচ্ছা, সো তুমি কাঠমান্ডু
only 10% duty.
And because only 10% because they have very low level.
So perhaps you should relocate your industry to Kathmandu.
আচ্ছা আচ্ছা, ও আই ডিডন্ট নোটিস দ্যাট দে আর 10%. আচ্ছা আচ্ছা,
তো নেপালের সঙ্গে আলোচনা করো বাংলায় কি আমার সুযোগ আছে নাকি?
আচ্ছা, আমি আরেকজন আমাদের রুবানা হক, উনিও আমাদের একজন ডিস্টিংগুইশ প্যানেলিস্ট আছেন, বোধহয় হয়তো পরে জয়েন করবেন. আচ্ছা, ডক্টর সলিম, প্লিজ স্টার্ট অফ.
Thank you. আমি extremely grateful ডক্টর জাহিদ সত্তরকে যে আমাকে এই প্রোগ্রামে ইনভাইট করার জন্য এবং এভাবে সুযোগ দেওয়ার জন্য। যে দুটো আলোচনা শুনছিলাম, প্রথমে ডক্টর জাহিদ সত্তর, পরে প্রফেসর রেভান্স সিনহা, আমরা দুজনকে কমপ্লিমেন্ট করেছে। আমি প্রথম খুব সম্ভবত অনেকদিন পরে এরকম ডিসকাশন দেখছি দুজন পাশাপাশি বসে, যেখানে দুজন খুব বেশি একজন আরেকজনের প্রতি দ্বিমত করছেন না। তো সামথিং ভেরি ইন্টারেস্টিং টু অবজার্ভ। তো এটা খুব আমার দুটোই স্যার এবং ডক্টর জাহিদ সাথে দুজনের আলোচনাটা একজন আরেকজনকে কমপ্লিমেন্ট করেছে, খুব ভালো হবে। আমার মনে হয় what Professor Revanth said at a certain point of time that you need to really look at the bigger picture. And when we were discussing about this issue, I think it's not only the tariff, but we also knew that development aid, which was badly kind of downsized through USAID, and also Trump's administration in terms of policies on climate change and various other fronts. So it comes as a package, and we see that it's not only the trade war or tariff issues, but when it comes to relation with the bilateral relation and also at the global level, USA as a big actor in various fronts, আমরা এক ধরনের রিট্রিট দেখতে পাচ্ছি। তো সেগুলোর ইমপ্লিকেশনও আমাদের কাছে মনে হয় যে when it comes to trade, bilateral trade with the USA as well as to other countries, these will have far অনেক বড় ইমপ্লিকেশন থাকবে এবং সেগুলো আমাদের হয়তো আলোচনার জায়গায় আজকে হয়তো সেভাবে আসেনি, কিন্তু we need to think about it. আমি ডক্টর জাহিদ সত্তর একটা বলছেন যে WTO যে ন্যাশনাল সিকিউরিটি এক্সেপশনের ব্যাপারটা, এটা আমার তো মনে হয় যে আমরা হয়তো এই জিনিসটা ব্যাখ্যা করতে পারি যে ইউএস ট্রাম্প যেটা করছে তার পেছনে হয়তো একটা লজিক হয়তো আছে, কিন্তু বেসিক্যালি এটা তো WTO কেয়ারই করছে না এবং সেটা আমরা তো দেখতে পাচ্ছি। সুতরাং আমার মনে হয় যে সেই যুক্তিটা ফলো করে ওখানে খুব বেশি এটা করা হয়েছে, বরং WTO ডিসপিউট সেটেলমেন্টে যে কমপ্লিট ডিসফাংশনাল হয়ে আছে এবং সেখানে এই ইস্যুসকে আমরা জানি চায়না অলরেডি কিন্তু এটা নিয়ে গেছে WTO-তে ইউএস এর এই অ্যাকশনের বিরুদ্ধে, কিন্তু আমার ধারণা এটা কোনো কিছুই হবে না এবং ফিউচার অফ WTO একটা রুলস বেস সিস্টেম যেটা প্রফেসর রেভান্স স্যার বলেছেন, এটা সিরিয়াসলি অ্যাট স্টেক এবং কান্ট্রি লাইক বাংলাদেশ আমরা বিগেস্ট সাফারার হতে যাচ্ছি। এখন একটা জিনিস আমাদের সেটা মনে হচ্ছে যে এটা কতদিন ধরে সাস্টেনেবল হবে ইউএসএ বাজারে। এটা স্যার যেটা বলছিলেন যে সে টোস্টার তৈরি করবে কিনা অথবা আয়রন তৈরি করবে কিনা, কিন্তু আমাদের যেটা মনে হচ্ছে যে এখানে ট্রাম্পের যে সেকেন্ড টাইম ফিরে আসা এবং জিতে আসা, এটার লজিকটা একটু বুঝি, এটা কারণগুলো একটু বুঝি, তাহলে দেখতে হবে যে ইউএসএ যে বড় ধরনের একটা ট্রান্সফরমেশন হয়েছে মানুষের চিন্তা ভাবনার মধ্যে এবং সেখানে যে এক ধরনের হোয়াইট ন্যাশনালিস্ট পলিটিক্সের যে একটা বড় ধরনের উত্থান ঘটেছে, সেই জায়গাটাতে তারা হয়তো ইকোনমিক লসকে স্যাক্রিফাইস করতে রাজি আছে অথবা একসেপ্ট করতে রাজি আছে ইকোনমিক লসকে সাম কাইন্ড অফ পলিটিক্যাল গেইনসের জন্য অথবা ন্যাশনাল যে ফিলিংসটা সেটাকে করার জন্য। সুতরাং সেই জায়গা থেকে আমার কাছে মনে হয় যে এটা হয়তো খুব সাময়িক ব্যাপার না, ইট উইল কন্টিনিউ। এটা পুরো 4 বছর যে নেক্সট 4 years উই মে হ্যাভ টু সি দিস, যে এটা চলবে এবং সেটার জন্য অনেক আমাদের হয়তো আরো অনেক আনএক্সপেক্টেড আরো অনেক কিছু সামনের দিনে আসবে। Probably this is only the beginning, so we are not sure what is going to happen next. সেই জায়গাটাতে আমাদের যেটা মনে হচ্ছে আরেকটা বড় খুব ইম্পর্টেন্ট ইস্যু হচ্ছে এই যে এখন একটা রুলস বেস সিস্টেম জায়গা থেকে more than 180 countries now dealing with 180 countries bilaterally. Does USTR have the capacity to deal with these countries within a short time? Although it will take a very long time. এবং সেখানে আমরা কে বাংলাদেশ অথবা অন্য দেশগুলো কবে কোথায় কবে কখন সে একটা টোকেন নিয়ে তার সিরিয়াল নাম্বার নিয়েছে এবং সিরিয়াল নাম্বার নিয়ে কখন সে সুযোগ পাবে এই ডিসকাশনে, এটা কি সেই রেমসমাস স্যার what he said, it's not only about that how fast you act, but also saying how important you are when it comes to bilateral trade with US. That is, in that case, definitely Bangladesh will be Vietnam থেকে পেছনে থাকবে। আরেকটা জিনিস আমার যেটা মনে হচ্ছে যে there's a kind of একটা rat race এর মতো, এবং সেই জায়গায় bilateral in negotiation there will be deal making with US, and এই deal making এ যে একটা better deal করতে পারবে, those countries will be able to make better deals with their better negotiation capacity, the kind of offer they can also make to US, and also they are better prepared to absorb the shock. I think they will be in a much better position. So I think a context probably we need to look at our own preparedness, our own set of policies, especially with respect to the tariff policies, trade policies, broader trade policies, macro policies, investment policies, and the whole spectrum of political, economic, and institutional aspects on the Bangladesh, whether we take it as a kind of chance to undertake reforms in these critical domains which we overlooked decades after decades, and so it's something whether we can do that. So in that case, probably I'll just make a small comment that যেখানে হয়তো ডক্টর জাহিদ স্যারের সাথে I'll have a little bit of যেটা আগেও ওনার সাথে আমার অনেক সময় আমাদের তর্ক হয়েছে, whether the tariff reform is whether it's sufficient. I would say it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. It probably is a necessary thing, we need to do it, but we need to come up with a lot of reforms in other areas too. And not only all the macro and investment policies as I said earlier, but also removing some of the very fundamental supply side constraints which many exporters face. So unless we do that, we will not really get the benefit of the tariff regulation. আর একটা দুটো পয়েন্ট গুলো আমি শেষ করবো, সেটা হচ্ছে যে what the USTR report mentioned, it's not only tariff but also LTVs and corruption and various institutional issues. I think we need to come up with very right kind of roadmap how we can deal with these issues. আমি স্যারের একটা প্রশ্ন উত্তর দিব যে why there was a quick response from আমরা কেন এটা করতে কেন একটা there was an urgency of a quick response. কারণ একটা বড় কারণ দেখেছি যে আমাদের যে দুটো মেজর কম্পিটিটিভ কান্ট্রি ভিয়েতনাম and Cambodia, they really acted very fast, and that shows that they were having their preparation since the beginning of the issue when it emerged, especially in January. And January, when Trump announced that there's going to be a reciprocal tariff or something like that, I think there was a kind of comfort zone in Bangladesh among the policymakers and to some extent probably among us as well, and all the stakeholders, that this reciprocal tariff is going to be imposed only on few countries, probably on India and few other countries. But it's not only the case, it didn't really happen. And I think Vietnam and Cambodia, they predicted that this is also coming up from them. And in that case, they had better preparedness, and they also came up with a list of products which they can offer to US at a kind of zero tariff or lower tariff. In that case, I think that I looked at their offer list, and what they did at MFN basis. It's not only for the US. And very categorically they mentioned Vietnam. They in fact came up with revised list of products, and all of these are MFN basis. So you can't, I think, যেহেতু Vietnam more than 50 FTAs আছে, so Vietnam is very concerned that they can't really offer this kind of benefit to US bilaterally, because other FTA partners will then ask Vietnam what we're doing. Bangladesh probably, since Bangladesh doesn't have any FTA with any country except this very small treaty with Bhutan, I think আমাদের এখনো সেই comfort zone কাজ করছে. But I think the way forward, I'll just end by saying that it's going to be a new world order, very complicated, very disruptive world order. আমরা এখন রিলাই করতে পারছি না যে US যেটা রেভেনসন স্যার বলছেন যে whether we're going back to this Chinese kind of regime, very common type. এটা রেসপন্সটা কি হবে, এই রেসপন্সটা কি আমরাও ওভাবে দিব নাকি whether in new world order we look at ourselves, especially the southern countries, whether we can have much bigger cooperation. And since the whole global trade architecture is going to be fundamentally changed, I think whether we can be the leaders, the southern countries can be the leaders to design that new trade architecture and have better trade and cooperation. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Salim, thank you. মানে you've just hit the nail on the head right now. A new, this particular disruption, if you could call it disruption, is going to set the ball rolling for a new world order. Agir old world order to মানে রিফর্মের কথা অনেক বলা হচ্ছিল, তো এখন আমার মনে হয় এটা একটা থ্রাস্ট আসছে যে এখন একটা নিউ ওয়ার্ল্ড অর্ডার না হলেই নয়। কিন্তু বিফোর আই মুভ অন, একটা আমি একটু বলতে চাচ্ছি যে আমি যখন প্রফেসর রহমান সোবহান সাহেবকে ইনভাইট করেছি, আমি জানি যে আমাদেরকে একটু সময় একটু নিয়ে করতে হবে, সুতরাং প্লিজ ইফ ইউ উইল এক্সকিউজ আস, আমরা হয়তো এক্সটেন্ড করবো, আমাদের যদিও 1:30টার সময় আমাদের এটা কি করে আমরা এক্সটেন্ড করবো, বিকজ আই এম গোইং টু লেট এভরিবডি who wants to say something and allow them to talk, okay? আচ্ছা, তো getting back to Dr. Salim's একটা point, যেহেতু he has mentioned that he has some disagreement, bolbo na, he's saying basically the tariff reform is not going to be enough. It's necessary but not a sufficient condition. I agree, but আমাদের যে tariff reform for export orientation, যেটা non-garment, যেটা আমরা এক্সপোর্ট ডাইভার্সিফিকেশনের জন্য যে ট্যারিফ রিফর্মের কথা বলছি, সেটা হচ্ছে ইটস বিকজ অফ এ ফান্ডামেন্টাল সিচুয়েশন যেখানে আমাদের প্রোটেকশন ফর দ্য নন গার্মেন্ট সেক্টর, উইচ ইজ এখানে ইট ইজ কজিং an imbalance of incentives between exporting versus selling in the domestic market. এবং এটা যে কোনো entrepreneur ke, you can ask them, when you sell in the domestic market versus when you export, where is the profit higher? They will tell you the domestic market is significantly higher. The reason for that is the high tariff protection that really gives you that scope. Ebong ekhane, how much, even if we agree on import substitution, okay, je eta dorkar ache, import substitution cannot be ad infinitum. Logic says if it is ad infinitum, you will not get much result. Second হচ্ছে এই মানে যেটা আমি বলতে চাচ্ছিলাম সেটা হচ্ছে যে export, this also gets back to your idea, যে export promotion.
You should not be arguing with me but with Mr. Trump.
No. Your point about infant industry protection by Hamilton. Yes, Hamilton did make that argument about imports. But we have a situation where infant industries are now become geriatric infants, okay, because of the ad infinitum protection they're getting and very high protection. I mean, you have to have some semblance of there's reasonableness. So, এই অবস্থাতে that fundamental problem has remained. That is why we are talking about tariff rationalization, so that there is a balance of incentives between exports and domestic production for domestic sales. I will tell you something. Bortomane, there is some research already Dr. Ahmad Hassan is doing. Bortomane, in the manufacturing sector, export oriented sector has become 70% of the manufacturing output, according to his research. And employment is also about 60% of output. So export and export oriented firms now employ 60% of our manufacturing labor and 70% of manufacturing output. Now, who are you going to protect more or support more? Export-oriented firms or firms that sell in the domestic market? This imbalance, this is a fundamental policy question that we have to answer, sir. আমি যাচ্ছি ডক্টর রাজ্জাকের কাছে। Thank you, Razzak. Thank you so much. I know the timing is for you. সকাল 5টার সময় বোধ ভোর 5টার সময় তোমাকে উঠতে হয়েছে। So I really appreciate your being there. Now it's your flow.
জেরি ভাই, থ্যাংক ইউ। প্রথমে আমি আপনাকে ধন্যবাদ দিতে চাই আমাকে সুযোগ দেওয়ার জন্য। আমি প্রফেসর এমর সোবহানের সাথে কাজ করেছি সিপিডিতে শুরুর দিকে, তারপরে আমি পিআর এর সাথে ঘনিষ্ঠভাবে কাজ করি এখনো। কাজে আমি দুটো আর্গুমেন্টকে একসঙ্গে দেখতে পাই খুব ভালোভাবে। এবং সেলিম যেটা বলেছে, ইট ইজ সাচ এ ফ্যাসিনেটিং থিং যে আপনারা দুজন এখানে বসে আজকে আলোচনা করছেন। আমি আমার আলোচনার শুরুতে আমি আপনাদেরকে একটা জিনিস বলতে চাই যে আমি জাস্ট গত সপ্তাহে একটা চমৎকার ডিবেট দেখেছি উইথ আর্টিফিশিয়াল ইন্টেলিজেন্স। তাদের একজন তারা ট্যারিফ প্রোটেকশনের পক্ষে বলেছে আর একজন বিপক্ষে বলেছে। আমি সেটার সামারিতে যাব না, কিন্তু এইটা এত কম্প্রিহেন্সিভ ওয়েতে এবং নাইস করে ডিবেট করা আছে, আমার ধারণা আমাদের সবারই এটা দেখা উচিত। আমি লিঙ্কটা আপনাদের সঙ্গে শেয়ার করব, আপনারা সবাই একটু দেখলে আপনারা দেখবেন যে হাউ ফ্যাসিনেটিং ইট ওয়াজ। আর্টিফিশিয়াল ইন্টেলিজেন্স তারাই করেছে আর কি, একদিকে ডিপসিক আর আরেকদিকে হচ্ছে ওপেন এয়ার তারা করে, এবং 15 জন আর্টিফিশিয়াল ইন্টেলিজেন্স, অন্য 15 জন তারা জাজ ছিল, তারা শেষে একটা ভার্ডিক্ট দিয়েছে। বাট এনিওয়ে, সেখানে আপনারা যেগুলো বলেছেন সবই কভার করেছি। আমি এখন মূল আলোচনায় ফিরে আসি। আমি প্রথমে বলবো যে জাইদি ভাই, হিসাবটা যেভাবে করা হচ্ছে, বেসলাইন ট্যারিফ ট্রাম্পের এটা 10% ইম্পোজ করা হয়েছে অলরেডি। তারপরে যেটা হবে, যেসব দেশের উপরে হায়ার রেসিপ্রোকাল ট্যারিফ দেওয়া হয়েছে তাদেরটা তখন অ্যাপ্লিকেবল হবে, ওটার সঙ্গে 10% তার যোগ হবে না। এটারও আমি আপনাকে একটা লিঙ্ক পাঠিয়ে দিব, যেটা লিগাল ইন্টারপ্রিটেশন যেটা আছে এই সময়ে, এইটা আমি একটু ক্লিয়ার করতে চাইলাম আর কি। সো 10% ওইটা যোগ হবে না যখন বাংলাদেশের উপরে 37% ইম্পোজ করা হবে। দ্যাট ইজ নাম্বার 1।
কারেক্ট।
ঠিক। তারপর দ্বিতীয় বিষয় হচ্ছে, দেখুন এই আমরা যে আলোচনা করছি এটাতে একটা ফান্ডামেন্টাল জায়গা আমাদের চিন্তা করতে হবে, যেটা জেফ্রি স্যাক্স বলেছেন, অন্য সবাই বলছেন, যে এইটা ইউএস পলিসি হলে ইট হ্যাজ কাম ফ্রম জাস্ট 1%, এটা প্রেসিডেন্ট ট্রাম্প, এবং এটা তাদের আইনসভার মধ্যে থেকে আসে নাই, এবং এইটা যেভাবে করা হয়েছে টোটালি এটা হোমসিক্যাল। আমেরিকা অবশ্যই সুপার 301 স্পেশাল তাদের যে অ্যাক্ট আছে ন্যাশনাল ইন্টারেস্টের জন্য, সিকিউরিটির জন্য, সেটা তারা ব্যবহার করতে পারে, কিন্তু অন্যান্য নীতি নির্ধারকে তারা একমত না যে ট্রাম্প যেভাবে ঢালাওভাবে ব্যবহার করেছে এটা ঠিক কিনা। আর সুপার 301 এটা ব্যবহার করলে একটা সেক্টরে আপনি এমএফএন মেক্স ব্যবহার করেছে এতদিন, অথবা কোন একটা পার্টিকুলার কান্ট্রি এগেন্স্টে ব্যবহার করা হয়েছে, কিন্তু ঢালাওভাবে সবগুলো দেশের বিরুদ্ধে ব্যবহার করা হয় না। কাজে এখানেও একটা আমরা দেখছি যে অন্যরকম প্রবণতা আছে। এক নম্বর, যদি আপনি চমৎকার করে বলেছেন যে মার্কিন যুক্তরাষ্ট্রের যে ট্রেড ডেফিসিট